Yeah. How dare you?
Now, here is a question. Hannah Colley's asked whether I'm as outraged as I'm sure Alistair is by the BBC's obsessive coverage of reform. It completely outweighs coverage of any other party. Please talk to us about the knock-on effect of this. Well, first, Alistair, over to you. Tell us about BBC's coverage of reform and what you actually thought about it and why you were cross.
I don't know whether it's cross. I just think that they've got, 5 MPs?
Yeah, this is something you've teased me about in the past, which is that, to be honest, I'd struggled often to name the chairman of any of the political parties, including Labour and Conservative. But the one chairman of a political party I really can name is Zia Yusuf.
Labour, Ellie Reeves. Conservative, Nigel Huddleston.
Good man, Nigel Huddleston.
Greens, John Knott.
Yeah.
Lib Dems, Baroness Caroline Pidgeon. Now, why can you name Zia Yusuf? Because I know that the BBC and all the other media outlets, they have to compete. They have to try and get our attention. But honestly, to get a breaking news alert, Zia Yusuf has resigned as chairman of Reform. And then Chris Mason writing this essay like it was the biggest thing in the world. Why this matters, why you should think this matters. And then 2 days later, Zia Yusuf unresigns. And it leads the news at a time when Gaza is kicking off, LA is kicking off, it leads the news. And the reason
it was a great story, though. It's a bit like Trump-Musk, wasn't it?
No, fuck.
It was kind of weird, wasn't it? Zia Yusuf comes, attacks Farage, and then suddenly he's back again. What's he doing going back again? I mean, it's like fascinating, isn't it?
Well, hold on.
Yeah.
And I did actually have some polite but spirited exchanges with Nick Robinson at the BBC Today programme, because they did Zia Yusuf at the start of the week as the main, and as you know from your politics day, 8:10
is the big interview.
That's where the BBC says this is the most important thing happening in the world today.
I remember. I think I only got about 4 of those interviews, and it was a big deal in my political career.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So 8:10 has sort of got this mythical status. And there's Nick Robinson. Now, I'm not saying it wouldn't get listened to, and because, people are thinking, well, who is this guy? Because he's just been leading the news for the last 3 days.
Not who is this guy? We all know who he is. He's the chairman of Reform.
So the questions were all about, so why did you leave? And he sort of said, well, I felt a bit tired. I found it very exhausting. I hadn't had a holiday, and this was not. And then Nick Robinson.
And clearly that wasn't the reason he left, right? He must have left with a massive falling out with Farage.
Part of the reason he left was because the new MP had this thing. He stood up at Prime Minister's questions and said, would Keir Starmer agree with me that we should ban the burqa? And Keir Starmer said no, and then Zia Yusuf put out a statement saying that it was a really dumb question because that's not even our party policy, which suggested things were already fraying.
Zia Yusuf is a Muslim who's trying to...
Yeah, but Rory, wait a minute. He may be a Muslim.
Yeah.
They've got 5 MPs. One of them Rupert Lowe's already legged it. Okay. They've got the woman who came in at the by-election.
We've all heard of him too. I mean, Rupert Lowe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've all heard of Sarah Potcher. We've all heard of Lee Anderson.
Yeah, Lee Anderson.
The only one we forget from time to time is the guy who beats women up, right? So my point is the Lib Dems, and Nick Robinson, to be fair, he said in his response to me, where I think you've got a point is we don't maybe give space to the Lib Dems and the Greens, right? But you can do that. Right. So I just think that this is, and I heard, right, somebody how can I say this without dropping a friend in it? Somebody very, 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 very senior in the BBC management structure. Very, 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 very
Not dropping
senior.
them in it, yeah.
You could almost say right at the top.
Almost, yeah.
Of the organisation.
You could almost say that,
goes around saying to people that the BBC has to get in touch with this angry zeitgeist and this populist anger, and we've got to shed our woke image. The woke image of the BBC has been created by the people they're pandering to. The Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the Sun, and now Reform.
Where Nick Robinson's got a point is that it would be completely mad for the BBC to ignore the rise of Reform. I think there is a decent chance now that something that hasn't happened in 100 years will happen in British politics, which is that Reform will replace the Conservatives as the major party. I think populism is the big story of our decade, from Trump to Milei to Maloney onwards.
I think the media is... the question is whether they're covering it or driving it. And I fear at the moment that... look, it's my old point I make all the time. Too many people within the broadcasting organisations, not just the BBC, but the BBC is more important than the others, that's the fact. Too many of them, they decide their agenda for the day by taking in the papers to their morning meetings and sitting around saying, oh, well, the Mail have splashed on it, we've got to cover it. Oh, the Times have led on this today. Oh, the Telegraph's got this piece by Robert Jenrick talking about his latest sort of stunt. We've got to cover it. Whereas actually, I think their job is to stand back and say what is actually happening. Now, the other point Nick made to me, and is a fair point, he said, look, if Keir Starmer's making a speech saying reform is now the threat,
yeah, that's a very good point, right?
That is a fair point.
So the Prime Minister himself is saying reform is the big story. Yeah.
That is a fair point.
Yeah.
However, that doesn't mean to me that you then say, when some guy that most of your viewers and listeners have literally never heard of.
No, we all heard him. Zia Yusuf. That's the point. You just proved that.
Most of the viewers and listeners had not heard of him until the BBC actually started to think this guy's a story. Now, I'm trying to be fair and reasonable here.
No, what?
Yeah. So when I had a long chat with Farage in the green room in wherever it was where we did question time, he actually, I remember it's the first time I really clocked onto this. He said, "Oh, we've got this guy, Zia Yusuf, he's shit hot."
In the absolute palace of truth, Alistair, was there not a microsecond of a moment after Zia Yusuf's resignation where you thought, "Let's get him on the rest of this politics leading and interview him"?
I'd still like to do that. I would still like to do that because we're a different sort of medium. I'm talking about the news medium, okay? So I think that it's fair. They're a story. They're doing well in the polls. But let's talk about the Scottish by-election.
Tell us about the Scottish by-election.
Okay, so the Scottish by-election up in Hamilton last week, okay? So the whole build-up was part of this, as you say, the rise of reform. Now, it is newsworthy. I accept that Reform did better in that by-election than they normally do in Scotland.
And the Conservatives basically completely disappeared.
Correct.
It was unbelievable, right?
Correct. That's part of the story. On the morning, let me tell you this, Rory. This will interest you. Let me just get you the betting odds on the day. Rory, the by-election in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse.
Yes.
Now, normally, a Scottish Parliament election would not be that big a story across the entire news.
No, correct. We barely know what's going on.
The reason why there was such a build-up to it, and why when the day happened it was live coverage, was because they thought Reform might win.
And is that because Farage was selling that story to them?
No, Farage actually was saying if we won this, it would be an absolute miracle.
He was trying to downplay. He was doing the famous Ken Baker Westminster strategy.
He knew that he was doing quite well, so he was trying to downplay. Let me tell you what the odds at the bookmakers were the day before the by-election.
Yeah, these bookies, they're always right,
SNP 20-1 on.
So if you bet £20, you'd make £1.
Correct.
Oh, that's rubbish.
Exactly. Yeah. So in other words, we, the bookies, think it's all over, the SNP have won. Reform, 9-1, second favourite. Good bet.
Okay.
Labour, 12-1.
So if you bet £1, you get £12.
And why were the bookies saying that? Because the media was building up the story that Reform might win this. And that's a better story.
Well, wait a sec. The bookies were saying SNP were going to win.
The bookies were saying the SNP because they couldn't believe that Reform could do it.
Okay.
Nobody saw Labour coming. If they're the odds, and that's the conventional wisdom, why is the story not Labour have done rather well here?
Yeah.
Taking a seat from the SNP.
That's the story you'd do, wouldn't it?
What was the BBC headline? Is Reform the real winner?
When the story should have been miraculous Labour victory.
I don't care what the headlines are, Rory, but I don't care about headlines. I care about deep arguments. But I just think it was a very interesting example of where the whole thing was framed within this context of the rise of Reform. Now, it was a good result for Reform.
Yeah.
To get 7,000 in a Scottish by-election was a good result.
And a terrible result for the Tories. What did they get at the end?
Unbelievable. Wiped out.
Yeah.
So that's the story.
Yeah.
Don't make the story about Reform. Could Nigel Farage be the next Prime Minister? The story is Reform destroying the Conservative Party, who got tanked at the last election?